to ask questions by utilizing the chat box located at the bottom of your Zoom screen during the presentation. Now, I am thrilled to introduce Evelyn Sanguinetti, Executive Director of the Wheaton-based Hope Fair Housing Center, and Rachel Watson, Director of Outreach for the Fair Housing Center. You all know Ms. Sanguinetti, who served as the state's first Hispanic Lieutenant Governor from 2015 to 2019. Previously, she was a Wheaton City Councilwoman, an Assistant Illinois Attorney General, and an Adjunct Law Professor at UIC's John Marshall Law School. Fair housing has been a long-time passion for her that began in law school, where she joined the JMLS Fair Housing Legal Clinic and the Fair Housing Association. Rachel is a recent graduate from Knox College who has a formidable background in nonprofit and social agencies advocating for tenants' rights. Thank you both so much for being with us tonight, and I'll turn the program over to you. Evelyn, you're on mute. Can we unmute you?
There you go. We did. I was born in 1970, guys, so bear with me. But I'd like to start by thanking the League for having us today. I've been the Executive Director of Hope Fair Housing since June of this year, but I do have a history with fair housing. When I was in law school, I served at the John Marshall Fair Housing Legal Clinic. And there I actually handled the very first of its kind case of first impression on source of income discrimination. It had to have been back in 1998. And since then, the city of Chicago has put in an ordinance creating that sort of protection. And it has outlawed discrimination based upon source of income. So I do have a history in that regard. I'd like to start off by thanking the president of the Wheaton League, Judy Beaver. Thank you for inviting Rachel Watson and I today. Barb, the vice president, thank you so much for having us. Jan Kay is my neighbor, and we've been friends for many, many years, and it's great to see you here as a specialist for affordable housing and fair housing. Kathy Cortez, thank you for the invitation as well. She's another housing specialist with the League. Lori Graynawi, I see that you're with us here today, a specialist for mental health and health issues, which also includes housing. I have a history with the League. I don't know if you folks remember that we used all of the data that the League had on the issue of consolidating units of government. And so I sure hope that we could work together and collaborate as we work on abolishing source of income discrimination. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our Director of Outreach, Rachel Watson. She is a rising star in our organization, and in the future, I'd like you to consider us for other sort of events where you feel it would be useful for us to engage with stakeholders and let them know about fair housing. Rachel, welcome.
Thank you so much, Evelyn, for that lovely introduction. As Evelyn mentioned, my name is Rachel Watson. I am the Director of Outreach here at Hope Fair Housing Center. And today we're going to be talking about the past, present, and what we hope to be the future of fair housing here in DuPage County. DuPage is an area that is very near and dear to my heart. I've spent almost all of my time in DuPage. I was born and raised in Downers Grove, did leave for 4 years for college, but then moved back here to Wheaton. So 20 of my 24 years have been in DuPage County. It's absolutely a spectacular place, and I'm very excited that I got to dive into the history a little bit more in preparation for this presentation. So without further ado, I just want to go over a brief breakdown of what we're going to be talking about tonight so you know what to expect. First, we are going to talk about who Hope is, why you should be listening to us, what we do in the community, how we can help you. Then we'll talk about what fair housing actually is. I know it's a term that is not always the most commonly heard, so I want to make sure we're all on the same page with what the definition is. Then we'll go into the history of housing protections, both nationally and locally, the current protections that we have here in DuPage County and across America. And then as the final portion of our presentation, I will throw it back to Evelyn, who will talk a little bit more about a specific piece of legislation that we are currently pushing that we hope you guys will support, and what we hope the future of fair housing will look like because of that. And then, as Barbara mentioned at the beginning, we will have a Q&A to wrap the night up. So if you have any questions, feel free to either make a note of it, put it in the chat, but we will be addressing those at the end. So a little background to what Hope Fair Housing Center is. We are the oldest and largest fair housing center in the state of Illinois. We were founded in 1968. And our mission is to create greater housing opportunities for all. And we accomplish that through a couple different means, one of which is through our outreach branch that is headed by me. And what we do with outreach is we travel around the state and do informational presentations to housing providers, to tenants, government agencies, other nonprofits, essentially get the word out about what those housing protections are. We find that people tend to break the law a lot less if they know what the law is. So it's our job to educate them about the specific fair housing regulations in place, and also so that people know what their rights are in case they are being violated. Another branch is our enforcement branch headed by Josephina Navarre. She's our director of enforcement. And what our enforcement team does is investigates complaints of fair housing discrimination. So if you think that you might be a victim of housing discrimination, you can call one of our intake specialists. They will listen to your case, make a decision whether or not they want to pass it along to the enforcement committee if there is evidence of housing discrimination, if it's something that we think we can help with. The enforcement committee then takes a look at it, decides what we can do to best help you. And then either we could do something like directly contact the landlord, the housing provider, get more information through investigation, really just figure out what we can do to help the best. So through enforcement and outreach, we're really able to bring our mission to life in both educating and stopping housing discrimination. So to give you guys a better idea of the area that we serve, we are located here in downtown Wheaton. As I was saying a little bit earlier, right next to the Egg Harbor. That's usually the big landmark that people are able to locate us using. But we are in Wheaton and DuPage County, but we serve a majority of the states. The counties that are in blue, we split with a couple other fair housing agencies. Since resources are rather thin, we want to make sure we're not duplicating anyone's work. So we are in close contact with those agencies to make sure that we are getting the most out of those resources. And then the counties in red, we are the only full service fair housing agency that serves those counties. So that is a very big area, as you can tell. And the counties in Southern Illinois, though they're not pictured, we still do serve individuals in those communities. If we have an intake from that area, we absolutely will do the best we can to help them, whether that be through directly using our enforcement team or referring to another more local agency for them. We just don't have them on this specific map because we're not able to, at this time, concentrate all of our outreach efforts down there. We are a small but mighty team. We have 8 of us here at Hope, and so definitely a lot of work cut out for us, but it's something that we're all very passionate about and that we love doing. So it really doesn't feel too much like work at all. All right, so getting to the nuts and bolts of this, what is fair housing? I know it's a term that I personally was not familiar with until I encountered Hope. And I think that's because there is not that much conversation using that particular term, both in the news and the media, in classrooms. It's not a very commonly popularized term. But what we define fair housing is as it's the right for all people to live where they choose, to have access to housing, and to have that full use and enjoyment of their home without facing things like unlawful discrimination, interference, threats, coercion, or intimidation. So why is this so important? Why is this something that we have been fighting for so many years? Well, there is a reason why the cliche real estate phrase is location, location, location. And that is because where you live affects pretty much every aspect of your life. A phrase that I hear a lot is that healthcare is housing, and that your zip code has a larger impact on your medical records than your family history does. And that's because your access to things like clean air, clean water, healthy grocery stores, actual healthcare itself, if you need an ambulance, the emergency services, how fast that ambulance can get to you, all of those are impacted by your geographical location, including things like the job opportunities that you have access to, the educational opportunities you have access to. If you have a job, if you're getting an education, how are you able to get there? Is there reliable public transportation? Is there a bus route? Is there a train route? All of those things are affected by your physical location. So that's why fair housing is such an important issue, because it really encompasses every aspect of our lives. So before we can talk about where we are at today with fair housing, I want to take a step back so we can figure out the context to the situation that we're in by looking at the history of fair housing. And to do that, we have to go all the way back to 1934 and look at the passage of the National Housing Act. It was signed by President FDR as part of his New Deal program, and it essentially created the housing market as we know it today. The passage of the National Housing Act created the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, and also popularized the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. So before this, mortgages were usually given out by private lenders, small banks, and given in small year terms, so for 2 or 3 years. So now with the 30-year fixed rate mortgage, a whole new generation of people are able to buy a home. This dream of owning property is really unlocked for millions of Americans who previously it was completely unattainable. And the targeting of this message, the government really advertised this specifically towards GIs who were returning home from World War II. The messaging that they heard is, now you can afford a home, you should buy a home. And in an ideal world, these opportunities would be available to everyone regardless of race or national origin. But unfortunately, the way that these mortgages were distributed had really big impacts on segregation and contributing to the wealth gap and to how highly segregated our cities and towns are. So there was a couple of different tactics that contributed to this high rate of segregation, one of which is restricted covenants, which was something that would actually be in the lease or in the deed when the developer was selling their property. They acknowledged the fact that once they sold it to that home buyer, they really didn't have any control over what that purchaser did with the property. So as a way to ensure that the neighborhoods that they were building would stay white for generations to come, was they would put a clause in the deed that said that the person buying it was not allowed to rent or sell that piece of property to someone who was not white. Another commonly used tool was contract buying or predatory contracts. What this entailed was a white landlord would buy a property and would create these contracts targeting Black families with very low down payments. It was a way to entice them into signing these contracts. And the family going into it thought that they were purchasing this property. They thought that they were taking on legal ownership by making these monthly payments. However, the way that the contracts were written were purposely misleading, so that in actuality, these families had no legal claim to the property until they made the last monthly payment on it. And the payment system that was created was designed to fail. So they would have these really low down payments, but the monthly payments would be huge. And it was set up so that that family would either have to bring on another occupant, another renter to pay them rent, which would then be a violation of the occupancy clause that the contract would include, or they would end up being late or default on a payment and not be able to pay on time. And when either they violated the contract or they missed a payment, the landlord had total legal right to immediately evict them. So all this time they thought they were gaining equity, they thought that they had a claim to this home, and in actuality, they really had nothing to show for it. So you had families who were paying rent for 5-10 years and then ended up just being kicked out and had no claim. It was also not uncommon at this time for just blatant discrimination to occur for real estate agents, for loan officers or developers to tell someone of color looking for a house that they did not allow non-whites in that neighborhood, that it wasn't a segregated neighborhood, that they would have to look somewhere else. And then the other tactic of segregation that was used that I want to talk a little bit more in depth about was redlining. And redlining actually came about as a result of another agency that National Housing Act of 1934 created, which was called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. So redlining the term redlining comes from these maps. They were color-coded maps that this Homeowners Loan Corporation created to advise lenders whether or not they should be giving out mortgages in specific neighborhoods. So it was broken down into 4 different color-coded categories. The first one was green, it was the best. Then was blue, meant that it was still desirable. Yellow was that neighborhood was in decline. And red meant that that neighborhood was hazardous, that it would be a bad investment for lenders to give out a mortgage to individuals in that area. So if you were redlined, if your neighborhood was coded as red, there was essentially no way that you were going to be able to be granted that mortgage when you were applying for it. And unfortunately, in the creation of these residential security maps that were made for cities across the country, it wasn't necessarily considered whether or not the person would actually be able to pay back their mortgage. That wasn't the deciding factor in grading these neighborhoods. The main deciding factor was the demographic of individuals living there. So I have here a scanned in photo of an actual area description from a residential security map that the Homeowners Loan Corporation produced. And as you can see in this box up top, the very first thing that they're considering is the population in that neighborhood. So the class of people, their occupation, the percent of foreign families, their nationality, and then as it lists the percent Negro that is in that area. So if you had an area that had a high population of Black families, it was almost guaranteed that they would be redlined for no other reason than the color of their skin. And what this resulted in was extreme segregation throughout cities across America, specifically in Chicago. Chicago is unfortunately a great example of the segregation that we saw in the 1960s and beyond. So to give you a little historical context here, the map on the right, that residential security map, that was created in 1940. The map on the, oh, I'm sorry, it's the left. So this one over here is the one created in 1940. This one over here was created in 1960. So this is after 20 years of these policies. And essentially, as you see, Black families were forced into segregated communities. You have specific chunks. You have the, oops. I hope no one peeked at those. That's later. We're not at that yet. But you have specific segregated areas in the city of Chicago, and very little mobility within those neighborhoods or in terms of getting out very little mobility for Black families to be able to go to the suburbs. I know it's in black and gray, so it's a little hard to tell, but the suburbs outside of the Chicago city limits here are essentially exclusively white. So these are the conditions that are taking place in the background during the Chicago Freedom Movement of 1966. So Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was actually a huge advocate for fair housing. It was one of the issues that he was incredibly passionate about, and he brought a lot of national attention to the topic. In 1966, in order to bring more attention to it, he actually moved his family into an apartment in Chicago's West Side to highlight the slum conditions that Black families were living in there at that time. And then during that summer, he led a series of marches around Chicago, and one of his main demands that they were marching for was that real estate listings should be available on a non-discriminatory basis, that no matter the color of your skin, you should be able to purchase a house if you can afford it. And so this energy, this movement did not just exist in a bubble, it also spilled over to the suburbs. At the same time that these marches were taking place in the city of Chicago, you have a similar open housing march, a photo here from the Wheaton City Hall in 1966, where protesters are demanding from the mayor that he make these real estate listings available to everyone. And Wheaton actually has an exciting piece of history behind it in that it ended up in 1967 being the first town in DuPage County to pass a fair housing ordinance. So Wheaton was actually on kind of the cutting edge with fair housing all the way back in 1967. Wheaton was actually the only town in the DuPage suburbs that had a population of Black residents that was over 1% of the total population. So at the time, Wheaton had a population in 1967 of 27,000 residents, and only 400 of them were Black. In comparison, Downers Grove at that same time had a population of 21,000 residents, and 6 of them were Black. And Hinsdale had a population of 13,000 residents with 3 Black families. So obviously, as you can tell from these statistics, a very, very low number of Black residents. A lot of the times you saw when these suburbs were being integrated for the first time, the first Black family to move in oftentimes had to have a police escort to be able to move in safely, to be able to move about the neighborhood safely. This article from the Chicago Tribune that I included actually mentions that one of the first families in Wheaton who was integrating claims to have like a positive experience, which is great to see that their child was able to play outside with the other children like without any issues. But that was not always the case across the Chicagoland area and across America when these neighborhoods were being integrated. Another interesting article I found was actually from the New York Times. The day after Wheaton passed that fair housing ordinance, the New York Times included an article recognizing that, acknowledging it as the first city in the DuPage area to pass such an ordinance. So this was a huge thing at the time. Fair housing was by no means a popular decision. Looking forward to the next year, 1968, was when the Civil Rights Act was passed. The Civil Rights Act included the Fair Housing Act. And in the time when legislators were deciding whether or not to include this open housing in the Civil Rights Act, it said that Lyndon B. Johnson, the president at the time, for every letter in support of integrated housing he received, he got 150 letters against it. So for every person who was supporting integration, 150 people were raising their voices against it. So looking here at the current protections that we have, it really comes down to the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act, for us here in fair housing, that's like our baby. We treasure it so much. We place so much importance on it because it was really such a huge thing. And it comes from the work of so many great individuals. Usually when you hear the passage of it referenced, you hear the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. mentioned, and it's because in the aftermath of his assassination, the riots that swept across the nation are really credited for fair housing being included in the Civil Rights Act and for the Civil Rights Act itself being passed. So we have Dr. King to thank and all those who at that time raised their voice in support of fair housing to thank for these protections being in place today. So looking at what the Fair Housing Act actually does, it prohibits discrimination in the renting, leasing, buying, selling, or occupying of a covered dwelling because of a person's membership in a protected class. And there's two phrases there that I want to highlight a little bit more. One is the phrase covered dwelling. That is actually the term that is listed in the Fair Housing Act. And it's not a term that you hear very often. You know, at the end of the day, when I'm saying bye to Evelyn, I don't say I'm going back to my covered dwelling. You know, it's not common vernacular. So what we interpret covered dwelling to mean, to be covered by the Fair Housing Act, is essentially any place that you would consider a longer term residence. So that could be a house, an apartment, a townhome, a condo, a long stay hotel. There's been cases whether or not an Airbnb or a boat would fall under the Fair Housing Act, but for our purposes, we think of it as any place that you would be at for an extended period of time that you might refer to as a home. The other phrase that I want to highlight is that membership in a protected class, because it inevitably brings about the question of what are the protected classes. So there are 7 federally protected classes, and then each state and local government can also add their own protected classes. So for example, Illinois, with the Illinois Human Rights Act, has added 7 additional protected classes on top of those 7 federal ones. So going over them really quick, we have federally protected race, disability, religion, familial status, which, in case you're not familiar with it, familial status is having a minor in the home, or also covers women who are pregnant. So essentially having children is covered as a protected class. Next, we have national origin, sex, and color. And then the 7 state protected classes that we have is age, referring to individuals 40 and over, sexual orientation, gender identity, military discharge status, order of protection status, which deals typically with victims of domestic violence, marital status, and ancestry. I also want to note that today, as of this morning, the Biden administration actually announced that for the first time, sexual orientation and gender identity, will be considered protected under the federal class of sex. So though they previously in Illinois were a protected class in housing, but now it also will be protected federally as well under that sex class, just like pregnant women are protected under the familial status class. As I also mentioned, each local government can add their own additional protections. Naperville, for example, has added a source of income protection. And I won't steal Evelyn's thunder by talking more about that, but make a mental note of it because we will discuss that a little bit more at the end when we're looking at going forward. So there's that black and gray map again that we had before, the racial distribution in Chicago in 1960. Next to it, we have a nice color-coded map from 2010. So this is 50 years after the Fair Housing Act has been in play, 50 years of having these protections, and theoretically, once that act passed, it should be the end of segregation, right? We have this great law, we have these new protections, so why are we still so segregated? And there's not an easy answer to answer that question, but I do want to encourage you all to really consider that, to consider the history that we just talked about, the familial wealth gaps that were created through years of discrimination, and the current protections that are in place today. Unfortunately, time and time again, we see a lack of knowledge about them. People are being victimized because they don't understand what rights they have. Landlords and housing providers are potentially unintentionally discriminating against people because they don't understand the fair housing rights that are in play. There's can be poor communication on fair housing issues. There's resistance to affordable housing and a high demand in the cost of housing. So all of these are issues that we see as obstacles, as barriers to having that fully integrated society. In terms of identifying when something actually falls as a fair housing issue, a lot of times we get calls and it's more of a landlord-tenant issue, or perhaps there's a concern, and even though it seems unfair, it might not necessarily be illegal. So how do we tell whether or not something is actual fair housing issue if it would be protected by the Fair Housing Act? Well, we use this formula if it's something that is happening to a protected class, and if it's one of those prohibited acts that we talked about before. So that's the denial of sale, rental, occupancy to a member of a protected class. So if it fits into that formula, then it would be considered fair housing discrimination. So let me give you guys an example of that. If you have a family with 2 small children going to rent an apartment, and the landlord says, sorry, this isn't a kid-friendly place, we don't allow families here. Well, familial status is a protected class. The prohibited act there is the denial of a rental. Therefore, it would be an example of housing discrimination. Now, an example of something that might seem unfair, but isn't necessarily a fair housing issue would be if I'm going to rent an apartment and I tell the potential landlord that, yeah, I work over at Hope Fair Housing Center, right by that Egg Harbor. They know exactly what I'm talking about. And this landlord thinks, oh, Rachel, I don't want that girl hanging around my apartment. She's going to stir up trouble. She works over at Hope. She's going to get the tenants to rise up. I don't want that type of trouble here. So they refuse to rent to me because of the fact that I work at a fair housing agency. Now that obviously is unfair, but occupation job is not a protected class, so it would not fall under fair housing. So there's definitely instances that we encounter that is unfair, perhaps unjust, but unfortunately under the Fair Housing Act, we're not able to act on. And that's when I really want to bring up the fact again that when we have situations like that, we have a whole host of resources that we're able to refer that potential caller to. So if you ever know anyone, if you have a situation yourself that you're not sure if it's necessarily a fair housing issue, we always encourage you to call. We always leave that phone call either with you knowing that we're actively working on that issue, or with giving you phone numbers of a place that we know can help you. So you're always coming off of that with a little bit of sense of hope that you know that you're able to do something to get that justice, to get that issue resolved. So here's a little bit of background on what we're seeing today in terms of fair housing complaints specifically in DuPage County. So these aren't all of the complaints that we saw between 2015, 2019. These are just the DuPage specific ones. As I mentioned before, we cover a large range of the states, but we were able to isolate just the DuPage ones because I want to give you guys a better idea of really what's happening in our backyard. I know that we have just spent a lot of time talking specifically about discrimination based on race, but that is not nearly the only thing that we see. The history of fair housing ties in so strongly with the civil rights movement, so it is impossible to have a conversation about fair housing without mentioning race. But there are many other protected classes that we advocate for and that we work with on a daily basis. So a majority of our clients are renters, and the protected class that we see the most daily discrimination with is individuals who have disabilities. Race is a close second there, but individuals who have disabilities is really a big concern for us and people who we advocate for daily. And I do really quickly want to highlight two of the ways that we do that advocating through reasonable accommodations and modifications. A reasonable accommodation is a change in the rule, policy, or practice that is necessary for a person who has a disability to have that full use and enjoyment aspect of fair housing that they deserve. So some examples of reasonable accommodations that we will frequently see is if an individual is being asked to pay some sort of pet rent or pet deposit fee for a service animal. Service animals are not considered pets. They are considered accessibility tools. So it's actually a violation of the Fair Housing Act for a landlord or housing provider to charge some sort of pet fee or pet rent for a service animal. Having designated parking on an accessible route is really important in terms of handicap parking in the if there's shared tenant parking lots, making sure that the parking spots that are available are on an accessible route, that there's no obstacles that that tenant would face on their walk from the unit to the parking lot. We're able to advocate to get assigned spots if necessary, or to get an increase of handicap parking spots if there's a need. Another example of a reasonable accommodation would be if an individual is having a mental health crisis and their landlord wants to immediately evict them rather than dealing with the issues that are arising. We can ask for an accommodation to, give that person time to seek treatment, whether that be to get on medication, to work with their caseworker, what have you, to be able to stay in that apartment without immediately being evicted, to have a grace period. So a lot of times when we're working with reasonable accommodations, it really comes down to being able to work within that person's individual disability. There's no one size fits all for an accommodation or a modification. It's really personalized to that person and what they need to be able to live their life to the fullest. Now, the other side of the coin of a reasonable accommodation is a reasonable modification. And that is a physical modification to the existing premise that allows a person with a disability to, once again, have that full use and enjoyment of their home. So examples of this is installing a grab bar in the bathroom, widening the doorways for wheelchair users, or installing a wheelchair ramp on the outside of the property. And all of these are things that it would not be a possibility for the housing provider to deny those modifications unless it proved a significant financial burden to them. It is important to note here that for modifications, the person who is making that request, the tenant, the individual with the disability, actually is financially responsible for making those modifications. For accommodations that we just talked about, if there's any costs associated with it, it falls on the housing provider. But for things like installing grab bars, installing a wheelchair ramp, anything like that, any physical change, that cost would fall on the tenant. However, the flip side of that is that the landlord can't make any aesthetic requirements or any requirements on that modification. So landlord can't say that, yes, you can install a wheelchair ramp, but it has to be gold plated and bedazzled and made of concrete and all of these fancy things. It's really up to the tenant, the person who's paying for it, what that modification is going to look like. Okay, so even I am getting tired of hearing my own voice right now. We have covered the past, we have covered the current, and now we're going to talk a little bit more about our hopes for the future. So I'm going to throw it over to Evelyn Sanguinetti to talk a little bit more about this important piece of legislation that we hope that you guys will support. Evelyn, take it away. Oh, Evelyn, I think you might still be muted.
There we go. Well, thank you, Rachel. I think all of you would agree that Rachel is a rising star in our organization. And please, again, I reiterate, use us as a resource. She is our boots on the ground so that we could get to all the stakeholders, because I firmly believe that a lot of people violate our fair housing laws because they simply don't know about them. And that's why we're here. So don't forget, we could be reached at 630-690-6500 or otherwise hopefair.org. Our services are free. If we cannot help you, we could find a non-for-profit that could help you. Let's say, for instance, we determine that you don't have a fair housing issue, but there is a landlord-tenant issue. We could connect you with Prairie State Legal Services or so on. So what we want you to do is to pick up the phone and to use us. We're not expecting you all to be attorneys and know about these laws, but that is why we are here. So kindly use us as a resource and connect other stakeholders to do so as well. So the next portion of this has to do with another issue. I'd like you all to raise your hands if you believe that affordable housing is the same as fair housing. Correct, it is not. It is a very, very close cousin, but it is not, affordable housing is not fair housing. In the realm of fair housing, you already heard from Rachel and what it is. Affordable housing is defined by Wikipedia as housing which is deemed affordable to those with a median household income or below, as rated by the national government or a local government by a recognized affordability index. So two completely different animals, but still very, very related and still very important. So we can make housing affordable in two ways. Government could get involved and it could directly provide money or discounted housing to low-income families. There could be that sort of involvement, but we can also create affordable housing in a second way, which is relying upon our policymakers to increase the number of dwellings in their jurisdiction, relaxing their restrictions. Sometimes in the form of relaxing the zoning restrictions. So those are the two ways. At issue today, though, is whether it is illegal to deny an individual housing because of that individual's source of income. Do you believe that it is illegal to deny an individual housing because of their source of income in Illinois? Well, the answer is it depends. Sadly, in most cases, it is not illegal to turn somebody away because they have a housing voucher or because they collect disability payments or because they collect alimony payments. It is not illegal to do that unless you're in a few jurisdictions. So let's put this into scope. Illinois is comprised of a lot of units of government. But I believe about only 6 or 7 communities in Illinois have ordinances protecting against source of income discrimination. And those locations are Chicago, County of Cook, Harwood Heights, Naperville, Urbana, and Wheeling. So right now, Hope Fair Housing Center, we're located in Wheaton. We have no ordinances in Wheaton, for instance, protecting individuals that have been discriminated against on the basis of their legal source of income. And it's the whole reason why I'm here to deliver the second part of what we're about to talk about today. A 2018 study conducted by the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights detected source of income discrimination in 49% of their investigations. So today, I am before all of you today to invite you to join our Fair Housing Coalition. We are seeking as a statewide coalition to abolish source of income discrimination. So you may ask, Evelyn, it sounds great. How do I get involved? And what exactly is it that you folks are doing to try to abolish source of income discrimination? Well, as I mentioned, only a handful of units of government have an ordinance protecting individuals against source of income discrimination. And we're all throughout the entire state of Illinois exposed. You take a look at the Federal Fair Housing Act, there are no protections for those who are discriminated against based upon source of income. If you take a look at the Illinois Human Rights Act, Rachel just told you all of the added protections we have in the Illinois Human Rights Act. But again, statewide, we have no protection against source of income discrimination, which brings forth our statewide campaign. We've joined forces with a lot of organizations like the Hope Fair Housing Center, and we actually have legislation that's going to be presented to the general public in less than 1 week. We have a lot of legislators now that are looking, and we're mirroring the legislation. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about them because you're going to be reading about them shortly. We have Representative LaShawn Ford. He appreciates the fact that communities need protections in the basis of source of income because his own community already has that protection. So LaShawn Ford understands the need statewide, and he will be sponsoring this legislation, which, as I said before, you will be seeing in the next few days, his proposed bill. And then we also have a co-sponsor that will be mirroring this legislation, and she is Representative LaPointe. And just to make sure that we encounter no hurdles at the Senate level, we also have 2 sponsors, a sponsor and a co-sponsor. So we have Senator Villavalum, and we also have our very own in the community, Senator Karina Villa. Their proposed legislation is going to mirror one another, which is great. And so you think, okay, now we have the legislators. For sure, we're going to be able to get through this time. But I got to let you know that as a coalition, we've tried this before. We've actually been trying to have source of income protections embedded in the Illinois Human Rights Act for about the last 20 years, approximately. But there have been hurdles. We have 2 lobbies that we've historically encountered. And we've encountered the realtor lobby, and we also have encountered the landlord lobby. We believe this time around, as a coalition, and hopefully with your support, we believe this time around we'll make it through. And I'll tell you why. In 2017, we attempted to do so, and we almost got that legislation through. I believe it was Representative Melinda Bush that came really close. But we've seen a lot of changes occur in the last few months. We've seen all of the unfair things that have occurred in our underserved communities. You remember we just talked about where you live determines your access access to world-class healthcare. Where you live determines whether you have access to healthy foods. Where you live determines whether you have access to world-class schools. I believe we are all seeing all of the problems that we're having these days. And I believe that right now, all of the people or all of the lobbyists that went against this sort of legislation will look at this in a very new way. It's very difficult as a landlord to turn away, let's say, for instance, a housing choice voucher holder when we're seeing that a lot of people have lost their jobs, right? And now with this housing choice voucher holder, the landlord could say, you know, this is something that we're willing to reconsider now because it is money in our pockets in a very uncertain time. So again, I believe the climate is completely different. If you take a look at the National Association of Realtors, for instance, you will see that their postings apologize for their past wrongdoings in the area of fair housing. So I think this is a different climate and there's an urgency of now. And this is why we're coming to you so that you could join our coalition because there is an urgency in now. Again, don't forget us. Please use us as a resource. And now I'd like to open up the floor to questions.
Thank you so much, Evelyn and Rachel. That's exciting. Be sure to send us the bill number of the legislation as it goes forward. We do have a couple questions. Mary is asking, municipalities of a certain size are required to present plans for low and middle housing of a certain percentage of available housing. Is there any such thing for unincorporated areas? If yes, who has the jurisdiction? County? Township?
Rachel, would you like to answer that one?
You know, I will be quite honest, I am not sure of the answer for that. Evelyn, I'm not sure if you're familiar with unincorporated territories in that way, but that is definitely something that I would be more than happy to look up and get back to you guys with, just so that I don't want to give any false information that I'm not positive about. Though, once again, Evelyn, I don't know if you have more familiarity than me with it.
Well, in unincorporated areas, it generally gets turned over to the counties.
Yeah, and if you
Dan
want
K's like, yes, it is. That is my understanding. Even though I live in an incorporated area, I do know that that gets turned over to the counties.
Okay. Second question. Diana's wondering if physical modification paid for by the renter as an accommodation for their disability leads to a trip hazard and the landlord is sued, who's responsible?
Well, typically, I'm going to give it to Rachel first to give her the opportunity because she did give the presentation in that regard.
So I believe that that would fall under renter's insurance, would it not? If it was part of the actual physical structure of it, that as part of having renter's insurance, it would be covered by the tenant, especially if it was inside the home itself. Once again, Evelyn is the lawyer, so I will default to her on that.
Well, you typically would turn it over to the renter's insurance. You know, we recently had a program because we received some monies on the settlement of a case, and we decided to use those monies for a retrofit program. And what we did encourage people that we made awards to is to use contractors that were fully licensed so that they could go ahead and follow all appropriate regulations and laws. That said, though, it would fall upon the renter's insurance. I would make a claim in that regard.
One other question. Have you seen an increase in your services due to COVID, and what kind of problems are you seeing today in this economic environment due to the pandemic?
Rachel, you go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say, so we did actually launch a couple months ago a specific COVID resource page on our website If you go to our website, I have it listed here on this slide, hopefair.org. And right on the top, it has our COVID resources. That definitely is something that we have gotten a lot of calls here about. There's been such a huge burden in terms of renters not being able to make their rent payments. And there luckily has been a lot of other nonprofit support and governmental support agencies that are able to help. So we definitely have seen calls on non-fair housing issues about things like that on rent payments. In terms of direct fair housing issues, there was a report specifically back in March of last year when a lot of the news about COVID was breaking out for the first time. HUD issued a memo kind of reinforcing the importance of protections based on national origin, because there was a large fear that specifically individuals who were immigrants here from Asia and China specifically were facing higher rates of housing discrimination. Luckily, we have not seen a huge spike in that. There definitely has been an upward trend. It has not been something that has resulted in a large increase, though that is something that in the fair housing community we have been especially vigilant in to make sure that discrimination based on national origin is being dealt with and is not becoming a major issue.
Thank you.
If I could add, we've also been seeing an uptick on source of income sort of cases where people bring in different types of sources of income through their church, for instance, through sources of income through COVID relief payments. And a lot of landlords turn them away, even though these are very legal sources of income, just because they determine that the people that come in seeking that sort of help are not the sort of people they wish to rent to. So we have seen an uptick in that regard.
Lori's asking the question, what obstacles do you see in getting the bill passed this time?
All right, so the obstacles are typically the two lobbies that are very, very powerful lobbies, and it's the realtors, and it's also the landlords. Many of them come forward and say, if the federal Fair Housing Act does not require us to do this, why should we impose that upon ourselves? And so that is their argument up top. And then of course, statewide, the same lobbies make the same argument. If the Human Rights Act does not require that we take these sorts of payments, why is the law requiring us to do that? As I previously mentioned though, I think things have changed. I think that now with COVID, we've seen how unfair certain communities are being treated. It's all being brought to light. We're seeing the Realtors Association also apologize for their past wrongdoings. We're seeing landlords taking a different look at voucher holders, for instance, because it's money in their pockets. Right now, a lot of our landlords are losing a lot because the people that they rent to have probably lost their jobs or so on. So even though these lobbies will be present, I do not believe that they will have the same degree of push that they've had in times past, because times have changed.
Excellent, excellent. Do you have, I'm just curious now on my own question. I'm working with my the high school students in my area, and what a great project for them to look at ordinances in their community for fair housing. Do you have copies of those ordinances that we could share with members of our local communities to, perhaps get support?
Oh, absolutely. So you remember I had mentioned the 6 communities in Illinois that do provide those protections, and we could certainly see that. But there's also a really good resource. It's called municode.com.
Oh,
where you could go, yeah, and you could go into any community and just do a general search to obtain those ordinances as well.
thank you.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, one more question. Does this legislation essentially mean every landlord must rent to Section 8 tenants?
Well, the landlords do have freedoms to evict the tenants. They still have the opportunity to, let's say some landlords require that you come in with more than 2 months deposit, for instance. Landlords still have liberties in that regard. And so I believe that at this point in time, again, times have changed such that if you're taking a look at voucher holders, that is secure money in your pocket. But even still, the application for voucher holders is a lengthy application. And sometimes there is a tenant that is able to get into the apartment beforehand because of this. So the landlords have a lot of liberties, and they could still have underlying requirements like the deposits that they require and so on.
Excellent. One last question and then we'll let you go, though I'm afraid we could keep you for another hour probably. Lori's asking, are there any particular legislators that it would be helpful for us to contact to state our personal support? And of course, then eventually league support.
Yes, well, I've provided the league with an endorsement form as well as some background information on our campaign. So if the league could please share that with the rest of the group in the event that they know other groups that would like to endorse the campaign. I will put together a list of our decision makers that probably need a little bit more of a push. But I do have to tell you that their position is they see it as an overreach, whereas right now we see it as an opportunity to do the right thing.
Right. Oh, Rachel and Evelyn, thank you so much for your presentation tonight. It's been not only instructive, but motivating for us to take a position moving forward, for all of us to know what's actually going on. So I'm going to turn the meeting now over to Judy Beaver, our president. Sometimes Judy has microphone problems, so I'm not hearing her. Hopefully.
No?
Now.
So thank you so much to Evelyn Sanguinetti and Rachel Watson from Hope Fair Housing Center. You've made us more aware of what we can do to advocate for fair housing. So again, thank you, as Barb had said. Please remember this program was recorded and will be posted on the Wheaton League website in the next few days. Also, please join us for a living room conversation to talk about homelessness with others in a facilitated discussion. The League partners with Wheaton Library for this program. And then next month for our Civic Awareness program, it's Women's History Month during a pandemic, actually. So please join us in partnership with Wheaton Library and the Wheaton Community Relations Commission for a Living History presentation of Florence Nightingale, who was the founder of the modern nursing profession. So thank you to everyone for joining us. We'll see you next month.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.